and there is a software now that allows to classify any list of names into these groups. I don't have time to go to explain in detail how we created this classification, but I'll be happy to answer questions later if you're interested in this. We have also evaluated this methodology looking at data sets where we know the ethnicity of a person and the name. And we found that on average it has an 80% accuracy, and the accuracy varies by ethnic groups. So some groups that are more established or have non-unique names, such as Caribbean, which has British surnames, it's not so useful for the group, but it's highly indicative for most of other groups. And we're currently applying this methodology to look at, for example, cancer database, public health databases, issues of political party representation, and residential segregation, which is what I'm going to talk next. You can look at this database in a website called World Names, where you can type in your name, or decide to look at names such as, in the example, Turkish names in Germany. So brief examples of how I've applied this to segregation in London, and then I'll go to the last example of European cities. So in London, I'm interested in these groups that we cannot measure through the census. So these are maps of autocorrelation, which is a measure of clustering, geographical clustering. The red areas are high autocorrelation levels for Turkish and Greek, like I showed before. And we have Polish, Russian names, Nigerian, and so on. So some of the groups, like Spanish or Portuguese, are called invisible groups because there's not much data about them, and it's only when you look at them through name origins that you start to get these patterns of concentration. This is also looking at the multi-group entropy index H, and looking at the diversity. You cannot see it very well here, but the most diverse areas in London are Tower Hamlets in this area here, and Brent and Barnet in the west. I've also applied this to different levels of geographical scale, and following the literature, as you use smaller areas, as my previous colleague said, you get more concentration and more segregation. Using names, we find that Sikh names, for example, are highly concentrated, the same as Irish names. And then we also have Somali groups and Japanese groups as highly concentrated. Whereas, for example, European names are less concentrated, but we divide them between Western and Eastern Europe. Eastern European names are slightly more concentrated. And the last example will be on a project that we've started to compare European cities using this methodology. So the problem with ethnicity data in Europe, as Frederick mentioned, is that it's not available in many countries, and many studies use different proxies. So they look at migrants versus natives, or issues of nationality versus foreigners, migrant ancestry, race and color, and so on. So this makes a comparison very, very difficult. The frequency of update is also very low, every 10 years usually. And there's a need for complementary methodologies to study segregation beyond these official statistics. So for example, Sacco Munster has tried to compare levels of segregation of different groups by in different cities. But we have the problem of here, what are these groups really comparable? If we get, for example, there are here Vienna foreigners, or somewhere it says third world. I can't find it now, but they're here. Oslo third world immigrants, Lille non-French. So these categories are not comparable. So my purpose was to use the names methodology using the telephone directories as a common methodology to look at segregation. I selected the largest cities in Europe that we had in our database, and city is unfortunately defined by the data that we have, because it comes from telephone directories. We use phone book cities, and this has an effect on the results. As a result, we've applied the analysis to 31 cities in 9 countries. In the UK, we use wards, electoral wards, which is equivalent to about 10,000 people. And in the rest of Europe, we use postcodes, but the size of the postcode varies by country and by area. This is a list of the cities. I don't know if you can see it from the, so the country, the name of the city, the population of the city, and the proportion of the population of the city that we have in our database. So usually telephone directories cover about 30% of the population. There's usually 3 people per household in general. Whereas for the UK we have the electoral roll, so we have around 70% of the population covered. The number of areas varies within each city, and as a result the average population per area also varies, so this has an effect on the segregation index. Oops, that we get, sorry. So I've calculated the index of dissimilarity, which is the most basic index of segregation. And to prevent small groups driving the results, I removed groups that had less than 50 people per area. And this is the result. The cities here are ordered in decreasing number of segregation. So the most segregated cities are the UK ones over here, and then we have some Belgian cities over here, Brussels and Antwerp, and then the rest of Europe comes like in a clockwise direction. The colors relate to the major groups using names. So Muslim names appear as the most segregated ones throughout all the countries. And then in the UK we have different levels of segregation for these groups. This could be an effect of the data, because in the UK we are using electoral roll data, and in the rest of the country we're using telephone directories. So minorities are not represented in the same way in both data sets. And this is the same data but in numerical form. You could read this through cities or through groups. So for example, the Japanese group, as I mentioned, it has high levels, it has a high index of dissimilarity in some cities. But then the Muslim group is the one that appears with high levels of index of dissimilarity in these cities. So to conclude, the UK cities seem to be more segregated than the rest of the countries that I've studied in Europe. The other countries would be Belgium and France according to this data. The Muslim group is the most segregated across Europe, followed by the South Asian and African groups. And then at a larger distance we have these small minorities with highly concentrated communities of Japanese, Jewish and East Asian. The issues, the methodological issues here are the high variability in the population size, and then the extent and the number of areas between cities. So for example, because I'm using, in the case of Paris, the definition of the city of Paris in the telephone directory, if I want to be a bit more precise, I will have to go and look at other cities surrounding Paris that are included in the metropolitan area and include them in the analysis. So where you put the fringe of the city also has an effect on the level of segregation you get. As I already mentioned, the other issues about differential population coverage between telephone directories and electoral roll. And the dissimilarity index on its own is not ideal, so we should use other indexes to cover different dimensions of segregation. Regarding the Onoman methodology, looking at names, it has a series of advantages, which primarily is that facilitates ethnicity analysis where there's no other data about the population, using finer spatial, temporal, and groups granularity. And we can do this in a cost-efficient alternative compared to actually going and doing a survey or collecting the data again. The ethnicity categories are quite small, so we can re-aggregate them in different ways. And one of the aspects I'm interested in is regrouping the groups according to different perceptions of how different they are. So we can regroup them according to skin color or language or how close they are to the, for example, to the British culture or so on. And we also use probability scores using the probability of a forename belonging to a cultural group or a surname belonging to a cultural group. And then we use the two probabilities to get the probability for the person. I didn't have time to explain this, but I'll be happy to explain it later. There are a lot of disadvantages with this method, and you're probably yourself thinking about them. So basically the names only reflect the patrilineal heritage. They're usually inherited through the paternal line. And there are different histories of surname adoption, naming conventions, and so on, and adaptations to languages of names. We have to do some decisions on name normalization, and there are also a few sets of publicly available data sets that we can use that has names, because names is the first things that gets anonymized in registers, of course. And it's not appropriate for reporting ethnicity at the individual level. It's good enough for this aggregate level or segregation or concentration, but it's very risky to use it at the individual or very small area level. And there are a lot of ethical considerations and privacy issues that I don't have time to review, but they're fairly obvious as well. And in the future, I'd like to expand this, improving the geocoding of European cities and mapping the results that I just shown on table, and calculate several segregation indices. Thank you very much.